Today it's my pleasure to introduce Alex, who's going to be talking to us about the dynamics of polarization and misinformation on social media platforms. Alex is a PhD candidate at the CDT in cybersecurity and is also a part of our information security research group and the iDrama lab. Take it away.
Thank you. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Oh, actually, let me unmute. Yeah, thanks Maria for organizing this. And yeah, so broadly, as Maria said, my research kind of looks at polarization and misinformation in social media settings, specifically how the two are interrelated. So how one can cause the other. Sorry. So how one can actually cause the other. One second. Okay, great. All right, so I'm just gonna dive into it. So as a brief sort of overview of the talk, I'm gonna start with a really short kind of introduction to the problem. That's contingent on a literature review that we got published in CSCW, through which we identified future directions. One of those directions that we identified was a gap between a linkage in echo chambers and hostile interactions. And that we addressed in a paper that we got published in ICWSM. So that's going to be kind of the first empirical work that I'm going to be discussing. Through that, we then dived into the sort of role of open-minded users to influence their communities from within, and that's a paper I just had accepted at DUP this year. And then I'm going to kind of go back to an initial sort of research question that we identified, and this has to do with social networks and the misrepresentation of science. So the idea here is basically how social networks can give rise to kind of these, network dynamics can give rise to kind of different misinformation vehicles. And finally, I'm going to conclude with a little bit of my ongoing and future work. So generally speaking, misinformation and polarization are both what we call kind of wicked problems. They don't really have a singular solution. They don't have a simple solution. It's really difficult to kind of, provide some kind of future direction in how we can resolve these issues. There's a lot of input from all kinds of different disciplines. So we have political scientists working on this, social psychologists, lawyers, computer scientists, and everything in between. And so that first task that we did was trying to link all of these literatures together. Lo and behold, disciplines tend to disagree between them quite a lot when they work on the same things. So one of the things that we noticed from this literature review that we did was that digital trace studies actually tend to find quite a high prevalence of echo chambers online, but survey studies actually tend not to do that. So they say that perhaps echo chambers have been kind of overblown. And that has obviously led to a few disputes. So some scholars argue that if echo chambers aren't prominent, then there must be something else driving these patterns of rising polarization that could possibly be driven by interactions between outgroup members that are hostile, right? So I do break my echo chambers, but when I kind of engage widely, that just kind of angers me. And so that's very unconstructive, and that kind of gives rise to polarization. So we had this question, like, is it echo chambers? Is it hostile interactions? Which of the two is it? And this meme is basically our research question. Like that's kind of how we got to that first paper, is why not both? It could be both. And that's what we wanted to study. So that leads me to my first project, which was the study of Reddit's kind of political sphere in almost its entirety. I'm going to get to that in a bit. And the primary questions we asked were whether users' degree of engagement with a political echo chamber is related to their likelihood of hostility and intergroup interactions. So we're trying to basically figure out whether echo chambers and hostile interactions, which are these kind of contesting ideas in the literature, are actually related and can co-occur. And the second question was, what are these kind of different kinds of relationships between political communities based on the hostility and the polarization of their user base? And crucially, how do these vary based on political leaning? And to collect our data, we looked at almost 920 political subreddits. So subreddits are kind of forums on Reddit. We didn't actually identify these subreddits ourselves. Shout out to Ashwin Rajadesingan for providing us with that list. And that's a great paper for anybody interested in this sort of topic to read. So Ashwin gave us the subreddits. We analyzed them. We collected the data for them. Every single comment that was posted on these subreddits between 2006 and 2019 So we had a pretty massive data set of about 420 million comments from 6 million unique users. And that's what I mean. We kind of almost looked at the entirety of Reddit's political sphere. That was one of the aims, to sort of get this bird's eye view. And then the next step was to basically make this entire thing more manageable, right? So with 920 subreddits, we kind of wanted to create latent communities to see their different norms and their different agendas. And so to do that, we used author similarity metrics between subreddits. We cast these similarity values in a network, and then we kind of tried to create these latent communities that were basically collections of subreddits. And we did that using the Louvain algorithm, which is kind of a pretty standard algorithm to use in this kind of work. And this were the results of this kind of exercise. So on that left-hand side, you can see the resulting network that only shows the top 10% of subreddits in terms of degree, so the most basically active subreddits. And on the right-hand side, we can see the actual communities that we found. There were 16 such communities we identified from this exercise. One thing that jumps out is that some of them are way more massive than others. So that first one on the top there, center left, is basically includes all of the mainstream subreddits that you can engage with. And we have some communities that are more kind of topical. So pro-Trump community that only included subreddits that were quite, supportive of Donald Trump at the time. And we found these communities ranging from left to right. So we had left-leaning communities like center left. We had right-leaning communities like pro-Trump. And then that third community, EU and UK politics, that was actually neutral. So we had a few neutral communities in there as well. And after we did that, the next step was to augment our data. And we did that on two levels. The first one was the user level. So we had to allocate every user out of the 6 million people to a home community based on where they were most active. So if I had 100 comments and 95% of them were in the pro-Trump community, then I would be a pro-Trump user. And at the comment level, we also amplified, we augmented our data using Perspective API classifiers. So we specifically used the toxicity model. Any score, I've fixed this slide 1,000 times so far, but it still keeps breaking. So that's meant to say any score above 0.7. If the toxicity score for a comment was above 0.7, then we said that that comment is toxic. That's kind of how we augmented that as well. And using this kind of idea, the next thing we wanted to do was examine whether there are kind of distinct toxicity norms within our latent communities. And this was a very kind of first approach. It was a very kind of early description of what's happening. So just to draw your attention to the alt-right community right there, that stands for alt-right. What we can see on this graph is the blue bars are showing home users at their own home community. So that's the toxicity that they have on their own home community. Then we have the orange bars showing the toxicity of other users posting on that community. And then we have the green bars showing how users themselves from the community behave elsewhere. So one thing that jumps out when looking at communities like alt-right is that that subreddit is toxic in itself. Like the norm there is just, it's a very toxic place. But actually, and that actually stands for both the home users and others. But when alt-right home users leave those communities, they actually become substantially less toxic. And kind of on the flip side of that, we have the libertarian community for which the opposite stands. It's generally a non-toxic community, but then when users leave, they tend to become more toxic on other communities. And so basically what this tells us is that there's likely some combination of norms within the communities themselves, but also user self-regulation depending on where they're interacting. So based on this, oh my God, sorry, I don't know what keeps happening. So based on this idea, we basically took that and put it on steroids in this heat map here. So this is basically the same idea as before, but this time we show every single cross-community toxicity level, okay? So just to sort of draw your attention here at the top, so we have the outgoing toxicity of center-left users when they're posting on the alt-right community. And that value there shows basically that 6.2% of comments posted from center-left users on the alt-right community are toxic. That's just one example. There's obviously 1,000 different values there, but one thing that kind of jumps out is that if we look at the horizontals across this graph, some communities are just red all across. So the alt-right community is basically toxic everywhere again. But things like the Democrat community here on the second row, that's actually quite a non-toxic community overall. So whenever these users post elsewhere, they tend to not be that toxic. Okay, so the next step when we had these values was to actually try and go back to our primary question and relate the degree of engagement with these communities with the likelihood of these users being toxic. And to do that, we had to, first of all, quantify what echo chamber engagement meant in this case, and we treated that as the percentage of a user's comments in their home community. So we took kind of a lax definition of echo chambers here, and we said basically that if a user only engages with a specific community, that community can act as an echo chamber for them. Of course, keeping in mind that some of these communities were just generally more diverse than others. So that was our value for echo chamber engagement, and we were updating that dynamically as a time series. So whenever a user posted a new comment, we would recalculate that echo chamber percentage, engagement percentage. Then we essentially logged an event whenever a user commented outside of their home community. So again, if I'm a pro-Trump user and I keep posting in pro-Trump, we never log that. But when I go outside that community and post elsewhere, then we log that as an event. You can think of that as a Bernoulli trial, where a success is essentially a toxic comment. And using these ideas, we built a mixed effects logistic regression model where we nested everything under the user level. We nested everything under the user level because users obviously have different propensities, individual propensities to toxicity. So we're essentially trying to control for user effects in this case. But really what we care about in this case is that beta 1 value. Okay, this coefficient here essentially tells us the sort of magnitude of the effect that echo chamber engagement has on the likelihood of toxicity. And using this model, we obviously performed this calculation for pairwise communities across all 16 of them. And we ended up with this kind of forest-like plot. Again, there's a lot of information. So if you are interested in specific kind of community relationships, please do go and look at the actual paper. But just to sort of take an example here, again, I'm gonna take the pro-Trump community as an example. So what this shows is that these coefficients, these values are the beta 1 thing that I showed before, where you see kind of asterisks. That means that we found a significant association. And the dots here are colored based on whether the communities we're comparing are on the same side of the political spectrum, in which case they're blue. So Trump and alt-right here, they're both right-leaning communities. They're red, they're opposing communities. So again, Trump, pro-Trump is right-leaning, but center-left here, we're comparing with is left-leaning. And then they're neutral or green if one of the communities in the pair is neutral. And one of the things that kind of was quite surprising to us is that there's no real consistent relationship. So if we look at pro-Trump, the more a pro-Trump user posts at home, actually the less toxic they are to be on the pro-Democrat community. And when we look at sort of a same-side relationship, so pro-Trump with libertarian, we actually see that the more a user posts in pro-Trump, the more likely they are to be toxic when posting on libertarian. And that was quite a surprising finding to us, but it was kind of difficult to assess it with this many comparisons. So our next step was to unify these results down across a topology, like a basic topology that would summarize everything we've just said. And we basically topologized cross-community relationships across 3 dimensions. The first dimension was toxicity. So that referring to the heat map I showed before. So the higher this value, obviously, the higher that community relationship will be on this particular dimension. So we said that this relationship will be inciting if these values between the communities were in the top quartile of values across that entire heat map. We said they'd be composed if they were in the bottom quartile, or otherwise they'd be basic. Then we also topologized across polarization. So we said that this relationship will be polarizing if the echo chamber and toxicity relationship was positive and significant. It would be depolarizing if it was negative and significant, and otherwise we said it would be non-effectual. And then in terms of political leaning, what I just showed you with the kind of blue and red dots. So this would be same if both communities were right-leaning or both were left-leaning, opposing if one was right, the other was left, and otherwise we said that was neutral. So based on all of these kinds of categories, we then counted the frequency of each type of relationship between the communities. And that's kind of depicted in this graph here. So the values, the numbers, the plain numbers you see are basically just frequency counts of the number of categories we have. And then the percentages are just how prominent they are. And the first thing that kind of jumps out is that looking at these values, most communities are basic and non-effectual. Okay, so they're in the middle, which basically tells us most communities really just don't care about each other that much. It's not that deep. So obviously, a lot of these communities have maybe flown under the radar this far. So they kind of remain an understudy space because we do tend to go for communities that are just toxic by default. The other really surprising finding was that most of the depolarizing and composed types, so the really non-toxic kind of regulating types, are found across opposing side pairs than same side pairs. And on the flip side of that, we also find that the inciting and polarizing types are way more common across same side communities than opposing side communities. One potential explanation for this is that enemies of these communities may tend to get moderated a lot more. So if I go and post a really toxic, if I'm a Trump supporter and I go and post a really toxic comment in a pro-Biden community, that toxic comment is probably more likely to get deleted compared to, say, somebody who's pro-Biden and just kind of cussing out Trump supporters. That's one potential explanation. But also, we kind of wanted to figure out exactly what's happening here. So the next step we did was to take a subset of these comments and actually annotate them based on where is this toxicity directed to. This was a manual annotation exercise based on a very small subset of comments, but really what's jumping out is that most of these toxic comments, when people are posting across communities, are still directed towards outgroups, right? So if I am a socialist user going to post on the center left community and I post a toxic comment there, that toxic comment is still probably derogating Republicans or conservatives, okay? So that's kind of what this shows, which basically supports that collective derogating of these political outgroups is more common than infighting between these communities on same-side pairs, although there is still a non-negligible amount of infighting taking place. Some examples of that we saw where, for example, socialist users fighting with anarchists about their ideology, supporting different candidates, stuff like that. And so just to conclude, first of all, whether users' degree of engagement with political echo chambers is related to their hostility in intergroup interactions. For most communities, actually not really, but for some others, this can go either way. So echo chamber engagement can either predict higher or lower hostility elsewhere. And for the different types of relationships between these communities and how these relationships vary based on political leaning, we actually find that polarizing and inciting relationships are more common among communities kind of on the same side of the political spectrum. But obviously, this is mostly due to collective outgroup derogation rather than infighting. And obviously, again, these relationships are very community specific. Some communities are actually really very civil, like the Democrat community. Others are very uncivil and toxic. So one example is the alt-right community. Funnily enough, also the anti-extremist community is surprisingly toxic, which is funny, but they're, I guess, toxic to other extreme people. So yeah, there we go. That's an interesting sort of tidbit. And again, content moderation probably plays a role in these relationships. So when we finished this study, there was this one thing on our mind, and that was, okay, if these people come together and derogate outgroups, they fuel hostility towards outgroups, can we then harness more open-minded users within these communities and play a role in kind of reeling them in, okay? And that leads us to our second project. This is going to be much shorter than the first project, okay? So I'm just going to basically blitz through this because it's, I think, simpler to cover. So this was basically an analysis of more open-minded Reddit community members and their potential to moderate their communities from within, okay? And the primary questions we asked was, first of all, what are the linguistic differences between open-minded users and others? So obviously, this is kind of a proxy question for, do they have the potential to change their communities from within? And secondly, do these open-minded users receive fewer social rewards compared to their peers? And the proxy of that question basically is that potential realized in the communities? For our data, we only focused on 4 subreddits this time. Okay, so they were just we didn't really want to do this kind of really bird's eye view, and so we found we collected data for a far-left community, which is Chapel Trap House. That's kind of based on a podcast that's discussing a lot of sort of weird ideas. It's kind of been associated with what's called a dirtbag left. So there we go. So as a left-leaning community, we also collected stuff for from Sanders for President. Right-leaning community, we focused on conservative, and as far-right community, we focused again on the Donald. Undisputed GOAT in Reddit studies. And then we basically collected all of the comments over our observation period for these subreddits. And that's kind of a description of our data set. So overall, we found approximately 50 million comments from 800,000 unique users. Next, for our method, we identified home users for each community based on user activity, like we did in the previous study. We eliminated the trolls from these communities. So we basically wanted users that were genuine members of the communities. So we said that every member must have a net positive score across their entire comments to filter out the trolls. And then we identified open-minded users. And we defined those users as users that also post or comment in a different community called Change My View. Now, for those of you that don't know Change My View, it is a place where there's quite heavy moderation. Okay, so they basically force you to engage when you're engaging with a post and Change My View, right? If I want to make a post, a Change My View, that post has to be about an opinion that I want changed. So I post that opinion there and I challenge people to come and change it. I have to do that in good faith. I cannot just go and basically tell people, hey, you know, there's no way you can change this. I must be posting in a genuine manner. And also commenters, based on the subreddit rules, must come. They must challenge my view. They must be civil. They must be engaging in good faith. So it's a very moderated community to basically promote these deliberations. And so we subset the users from each of these 4 subreddits that also engage with this community. And then we match them to the closest control users in their communities based on propensity score matching on account features. Again, this slide is also broken for some reason. Sorry about that. And as I said, I'm going to blitz through this, but our first assessment was between linguistic differences between these users. Also, we did perform some validation just to make sure that, you know, that Change My View participation is meaningful, but you can ask me about that later. So in terms of linguistic differences, we analyzed readability. That was just basically rudimentary readability formulas that give you a grade level based on how advanced your text is. And we did find that Change My View participants actually tend to write longer texts, and they tend to write with more advanced grade levels. We also analyzed hostility based on perspective API models. And we found that Change My View participants actually tend to be less toxic, less profane, less insulting overall. And in terms of psychological traits, we based this on some LUIC dictionaries, so the really high-level categories that LUIC offers. And we found that Change My View participants tend to use more authentic language, so they're more personable, but they tend to be less analytical and less confident. And this analytical trait is also kind of going into the confident territory. We found that quite a few of these high-scoring analytical comments also have a fairly sort of confident language in them. So that was kind of the linguistic profile of these users. And we also performed some topic and named entity recognition analyses, but I'm not going to show them here because they take up quite a bit of space. And in terms of differences in rewards, we actually found that Change My View participants do tend to receive fewer upvotes than their peers. So just looking at sort of the medians here, we find that for every single scenario, so in every single subreddit, case users refer to Change My View participants, right? So the median is lower for the Change My View participants in every single case, and we find significant differences in Mann-Whitney U tests across all 4 subreddits except for, well, 3 subreddits except for conservative. But then we also kind of run a sensitivity analysis just to make sure that this was also the case when we went for sort of a mean-based analysis instead of a median-based analysis. Again, lots of stats here, but the basic point is that we find in every case that Change My View participants have lower mean scores. The percentage differences can be quite large. So in the case of Sanders for president, we find a 20% difference in mean scores. And this is actually significant in all 4 subreddits when we are looking at sort of log transformed metrics, which are more appropriate for kind of task we used, but not for conservative when it is non-log transformed, which is again, so conservative is a bit more iffy, but generally speaking, the pattern is consistent in that Change My View participants receive fewer social rewards. And so in terms of the conclusions from the study, we find that Change My View participants do tend to use more moderate language, but they also use they use more advanced, less hostile, more personable language, but less confident. So they do have the potential to moderate their communities from within, but they also actually receive fewer social rewards from their communities. So their potential is not really fully realized in these cases. And I'm kind of I'm gonna sort of reel it back a bit now. So that was kind of one of the strands that we were looking at. It did kind of raise some interesting questions with regards to whether there is any potential for network dynamics in these cases, because we did find kind of this preference for bias overall in these communities, whether network dynamics can actually contribute towards the kind of information flows across the platforms. Okay, so in this final project that we did, we looked at sort of scientific misinformation based on network dynamics, how they basically flew across network dynamics. So because Reddit is not really a network-based platform. This time we opted to go for Twitter. And we specifically kind of looked at the propagation of false consensus. Okay, so the primary questions we asked in this case were whether public Twitter discussions of COVID-19 science follow scientific consensus, and secondly, whether certain sources disproportionately drive public conversations around COVID-19. So we decided to sort of focus on a particular sort of subset of misinformation, which is misrepresentation of science in COVID-19. So that was kind of quite a niche topic. For our data collection, we started off by a paper repository co-hosted by bioRxiv and medRxiv. So basically, they chunk every single COVID preprint that comes out in this repository. We got all of the papers up to that point from there. And then we also queried the actual bioRxiv and medRxiv servers to get more information about the preprints. So things like whether they went on to be published or not, and also if they were published, where they were published. We also got the DOIs for the publications. And then we queried both the preprint DOIs and the published DOIs through Altmetric. So Altmetric is basically a service that tracks paper popularity data. It gives you things like citation metrics. It gives you things like how many times they were mentioned on the news or on Twitter. And it also actually gives you tweet IDs for any tweet that tweeted about these papers. So we also collected those tweet IDs, and then we hydrated them through the Twitter API. After that, we kind of extract the paper popularity data, and we also extract the Twitter data using the Twitter API. And this is kind of the resulting data set that we had. So in terms of papers, we collected about 25,000 papers. And in terms of tweets, we found 24 million tweets from approximately 350,000 unique users. With this data, the next step was to actually classify our users. So to do that, we said that there are two potential classes in this kind of argument around COVID-19 science, the discussions of COVID-19 science. So we treated them as anti-consensus users that we called contrarians, and pro-consensus users that we called conformists. And then we annotated 200 randomly sampled users based on their tweet contents. So for 200 random users, we extracted their tweets, read them, and then annotated them based on what we whether they were contrarians or conformists. And then we used the retweet network from this entire sort of conversation to train a node classification graph convolution network with a 5-fold validation. We achieved a 98% accuracy on that. And this is kind of the resulting graph. So the red parts here show the contrarian users, and the blue parts show the conformist users. Approximately 30% of this plot is contrarian users. Okay. So the next step was to then classify our papers. So we got a metric for sort of public consensus. Now it's time to sort of move on to scientific consensus on COVID-19 issues. The first step we did was we passed all of the paper abstracts through BERT topic. It's kind of a new model that allows you to sort of, derive what the paper is basically about, right? So we extracted these topics, and then we focused on the topics that were most mentioned on Twitter. So we focused on the papers that accumulated the most mentions, and then looked at what the topics for those papers were. So we determined 4 high interest topics based on the volume of Twitter discussions about them. And these topics were about vaccines, COVID-19 dangers, which includes mortality. It includes things like long COVID, neurological damage, etc. Non-pharmaceutical interventions, things like lockdowns, masks, etc. And also pharmaceutical interventions or drugs, okay? And this includes things like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, and even approved drugs like remdesivir, etc. Then for each topic, we manually annotated 200 random papers. We said that these papers are either contrarian consistent or conformist consistent. We didn't say they're contrarian or conformist, because that would be a misnomer, right? So the paper comes out and says, there's a potential association between vaccines and myocarditis. There is an association there, so it's not a contrarian paper, but it is a paper that can kind of offer an agenda to people that might be willing to sort of distort the science on that, right? So that's how we followed this exercise. And then we omitted any unclear papers or papers for which this kind of classification was not applicable. We also actually annotated the top 20 most mentioned papers per topic. That will become clear why we did that in a bit, hopefully. And so with this exercise, we then managed to sort of calculate the scientific consensus ratio based on these random samples of papers, right? So for example, if 4% of papers on vaccines were contrarian consistent, we said that scientific consensus on that is like 4% contrarian, 96% conformist. And with this annotations and this kind of augmentations of our data, we then were able to answer whether there is a false consensus. Surprise, yes, there is a massive false consensus on Twitter. So this table kind of outlines our main findings, okay? For each topic, we actually see the percentage of contrarian papers, kind of on that third column. We also see the percentage of contrarian tweets. And then we have that discrepancy factor between the percentage of contrarian tweets or users and the percentage of contrarian papers. And we actually find that for vaccines, for example, there's 10 times as many tweets that are contrarian as what we should be expecting if they were kind of following scientific consensus. Okay, so it's basically a basic division between contrarian tweets and papers. And that phi value at the end shows the effect size of this. So anything above 0.5 is meant to be a really, really kind of a large effect size. So 2 in this case is a massive effect size. Okay, and looking at just the top 20 most mentioned papers per category, we actually see that the percentage of contrarian papers within those top 20 is substantially higher compared to the random sample. So again, in the case of vaccines, just 4.2% of the overall papers are contrarian, but when we look at the top 20 in the sample, 50% of those super mentioned papers are contrarian, okay? So these kind of super highly mentioned papers are probably driving these patterns in terms of contrarianism on Twitter. This is also exemplified by this figure here, where the blue horizontal line shows you the cumulative percentage of mentions that the top 20 papers get, okay? So basically these top 20 papers accumulate anywhere between 35 and approximately 70% of the entire Twitter mentions for that topic. Just 20 papers out of thousands, okay? So this is a pretty massive sort of driving factor. Whether certain sources are actually more responsible, we find that yes, they are when the source is primary. Again, very popular papers do drive these consensus, sort of false consensus ideas, but it doesn't really matter whether you're a contrarian user or whether your tweet is contrarian or not, because in those cases, you don't really get more engagement out of that as a result. So just to exemplify that a bit, we find that a random contrarian consistent paper will receive more Twitter mentions than a random conformist consistent one, 68.5% of the time. Okay, that's kind of again, pretty high value there. And in terms of the actual predictors of the number of Twitter mentions for a specific paper, we find that when we kind of control for several factors, we find that the only really significant driving differences is whether the paper is contrarian consistent or not. And that shows the highest effect. The number of news mentions that the paper accumulates. So that could be because the more a paper is mentioned on the news, the more it's going to get picked up by Twitter, or journalists just basically go for papers that are already being mentioned in the public sphere, and then how recent the paper is. So more recent papers tend to get more news mentions, more Twitter mentions. But on the flip side of that, in terms of the predictor of retweets for a specific tweet, basically all of these are significant because we had a load of tweets. So we had really high statistical power to detect effects here. But really the only two factors that don't show kind of a negligible difference, sort of a negligible effect, are really the number of followers of the tweeting account and whether that tweeting account is verified or not. We also see a really kind of slight effect of contrarianism there, but that's a very small coefficient. So that's not really that important. And for user level retweets, so the number of retweets that a user accumulates themselves over their entire tweet DOM, I guess, only the number of followers significantly predicts their total retweets. So again, the basic point is that paper, when the primary source, when the source is primary, it's a paper, it does have the potential to drive more discussion, but not when it is a secondary source. So as conclusions to this particular project, we do find that network dynamics on Twitter do elucidate a false consensus effect, okay? And so basically, this creates the mistaken perception of scientific contestation when that doesn't really exist. So scientific contestation is not really a thing, but it seems to be the case based on if you were to engage with Twitter. This potentially drives current narratives, things like we were right all along, and it will possibly continue to drive these in the future as well. So COVID-19 was a farce, for example, might be something we hear down the line by people that kind of engaged in this sort of discussion. And this is predominantly driven by cherry picking or overemphasizing narrative affirming science. So in terms of my ongoing and future work, just again, very briefly going to touch on this. At the moment, I'm working on a project on YouTube that is examining the emergence of social identities and dehumanizing narratives in the context of world conflicts. And as part of that, we're going to be looking at both of these polarization dynamics and how disinformation, misinformation narratives may fuel these or be fueled by them. I'm also kind of trying to conduct a sort of more causal study to establish a causal role of social identities in misinformation adherence, which is kind of, I guess, the sort of overall, I guess, elevator pitch of my entire PhD. So basically, we're asking things like, do identity level interventions reduce misinformation above and beyond individual level interventions? So for example, if I deliver sort of a correction or a fact check, is that fact check more effective when it comes from somebody that is, from your party as opposed to just a random fact-checking organization, things like that. Okay, it's a multi-study sort of project, but that's kind of the gist of it. I would like to give a massive thank you to these people. Thank you, Tristan's obviously here, so I tried to pick a good picture. There's tons of people that I really want to thank, but unfortunately, I don't have the space to do that here. But of course, thank you also for coming to the talk. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it, learned something from my ramblings, and if you have any questions, happy to take them.
Let me just stop the recording.